Welcome to The Story Behind the Story, a behind-the-scenes exploration of the human experience in all aspects of life, love, and leadership. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dimple Dhabalia. Dimple is the founder of Roots in the Clouds, a boutique consulting firm specializing in normalizing workplace mental health care and using the power of story to heal individual and organizational trauma and moral injury. She is also a coach, facilitator, storyteller, and leader of leaders. Dimple's cutting-edge work at the intersection of leadership, mindful awareness, storytelling, and advocacy serves to unpack and heal old narratives, mitigate trauma and burnout, and create meaningful connections between people working in mission-driven spaces. She is the author of the soon-to-be-released Tell Me My Story, a deep dive into the power of healing our stories and their fundamental impact on enhancing our mental, physical, emotional, relational, and spiritual health and well-being. I'm your host, Angie Bailey.
Hi, I'm a co-host, Lynette Sprowls.
Hi, I'm also your co-host, Dominic.
Dimple, first of all, thank you so much for coming on our show today. It is such a pleasure. I have to tell you, from the very first sentence on the very first page of your book, it had me captivated. Your stories throughout are remarkable. They provide an incredible glimpse into what has allowed you to continue showing up as the best version of yourself, for your loved ones, and for the people you served and continue to serve today. Tell me how this idea of writing your own story was motivated by the stories that were shared with you throughout your career while living, working, and traveling in more than 40 countries, serving some of the most vulnerable people in the world.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. Yeah, it's a great question. So I spent my life, without even realizing it, being in a space of storytelling. So I spent almost 18 years working on asylum and refugee issues in the government, and 12 of those were actually on the front lines. So first as an asylum officer and later doing refugee work out around the world. And what was interesting and what I didn't actually realize until I started writing the book was how much of my own story was mirrored in the people that I was serving. And so things like displacement, things like violence, the stories that I was hearing day in, day out were very familiar. And I didn't realize until later, how familiar. But part of this was that when I was out there in the field doing the work, in sitting there with people and kind of bearing witness to their stories, I was just taking it all in and I wasn't able to let go of it. And so as a result of after 6 years of doing the work, I started experiencing vicarious trauma. A few years later, I experienced some moral injury in the work. And nobody was talking about this, especially in the government. We have a lot of, I think, fear around, and not just the government, I think anywhere, there's a lot of fear around mental health in the workplace. But for us, there was the added layer of, security checks, security clearances, things like that. And so it was very isolating at first. I didn't want to talk to anybody around what I was feeling. And I just thought there was something wrong with me. But the more that I kind of sat with it and started looking at what I could do for myself, it occurred to me that I couldn't be the only one going through this, that this type of work where you're, being human is messy enough. And then when you talk about serving humans, it's really messy. And so I had a feeling that there had to be other people who were experiencing this. And so the more that I actually started talking about it and advocating within my workplace, more people started to kind of say, yeah, you know what, I'm kind of experiencing some of this too. And so I was just kind of collecting these things. And my thought was, let me write a book on leadership or, more from that angle. But when I actually sat down and started writing, I realized I couldn't do it until I actually told my story. And it was in the telling of my story that I was able to pull out so much that what I'm hearing from other people who have read advanced copies is that there's so much to relate to because, again, these are things that people are experiencing, but we just don't talk about in our culture.
Yeah, and it really comes through, I think, in your book as well, that, your stories and how they're woven in from the stories that, that you were experiencing, that were being told to you. And so I do find it fascinating. In fact, I think that that's one of the things with Lynette and I held a energy renewal retreat back in November. And I think that that's one of the things, as you were talking, Dimple, is one of the things, Lynette, I was just thinking like, wow, like, you know what I mean? As the stories were coming out from the ladies, even from Lynette, from yourself, it's like there is a healing in through telling your own story.
Yeah, thank you, Dimple, for sharing your story. I've had a past where I was in a very abusive childhood. And so kind of, I think what Angie's trying to speak to is as we were doing our energy renewal retreat, I was very vulnerable and I really shared my story, but I didn't share it from a victimized standpoint. I shared it from, here's my recovery story. And it felt like because I was very vulnerable and shared some very intimate things about my life, it really let other people just open up. And we just had this beautiful synergy because we all just dropped into this healing space together. And from what I'm hearing you say, you've really been able to shift that perspective from victim into how can I overcome this and use this to help support others. I was curious though, when you were talking, you said there was kind of this point where you realized and you recognized oh, wow, this is much deeper in my life than I had thought. Was there any one particular thing that helped you come to that realization? Or do you think it was multiple things that kind of led to that shift in perspective?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I want to say just to what you were saying, though, that there is definitely so much healing in sharing your story, right? And to the other part of your question of what was the event? I think there's an element of kind of mindful awareness that comes into all of this, right? So in the book, I talk about how the book follows what I call kind of our story healing cycle. And so part one is what I call shaping stories. So these are kind of the experiences that we have in life starting in childhood that really create the lens through which we then experience the world, experience ourselves. And then we have our surviving stories. And so our surviving stories are basically our nervous system reactions that have protected us, right, through all the things that have shaped us. And so to what you're getting at, part three is about seeing. And so seeing is the point in time where you finally start to notice some of these patterns. You start to notice things that were happening. And I always feel like it's easy to connect the dots looking backwards, right? And so for me, when I started my career, I'm an attorney by training, and I was working at the Attorney General's office in Denver. And we were part of a unit that worked on a lot of cases involving child abuse and neglect. And so they were really tough cases, but had a really great boss. And he felt very strongly about making sure that our little unit of people, every year we had to go through a training on vicarious trauma. And for people who don't know, vicarious trauma is basically where you are kind of taking on other people's trauma. So you're either listening to other people's stories or you're seeing a particular violent image or something, and you experience the same type of trauma that the other person did, even though you weren't actually there. And I remember as a young attorney, I thought, why are we doing this? I don't need this. I can sit in my office and eat a sandwich while I read these cases, which probably should have been a red flag too. But it planted a seed. And so a full decade later, I was actually in Zambia on assignment. And it was the worst caseload I had ever interviewed. And so we were interviewing the last of the 94 Rwandan genocide survivors. And those cases were tricky because they were Hutu-Tutsi couples, and the Hutus were involved in carrying out the genocide. So there was this added level of just fear that you were going to let the wrong person in. We were also interviewing what we call protracted Burundians. So these were individuals who had been born into refugee camps, and then the camps were subsequently attacked again. And so they were kind of refugees twice over. And then we were interviewing Congolese applicants. And the horrific nature of what was happening in war in the Congo was just beyond anything that I had heard. And it was my tipping point. And so during that whole 2 weeks that we were there, I had a really hard time regulating my emotions during the interviews. Normally, I had my little wall of professionalism that I could stand behind. I could do my job. And so I'm in these interviews kind of crying along with the applicants. When we'd leave the interview site, our days were very, very long. When we'd leave in the evenings, most of us would just head to the bar. I was really struggling to sleep. And if I did fall asleep, I'd have really, really vivid nightmares where I was reliving experiences that I'd heard about. So I knew like something wasn't right. I just wasn't sure what. And I didn't feel like I could talk to anybody about it. And so when I got back from my assignment, there was something that just went off in my mind that like reminded me about the vicarious trauma piece. And so I looked it up. I felt like I had all the, things that it was talking about. And so I really started kind of down this path of looking at what I was experiencing and how can I fix this for myself. But this idea that and I think a lot of people go through this where you have some kind of like an event, a traumatic event that pushes you to that point of where you start noticing this. And so for me, that was the point at which I started noticing my patterns. I started noticing my reactions. I started noticing how these things were impacting me. And it was leading me to make different choices. And that's really what we want to do. And so part 3 of the book is seeing, and then next it comes shifting. And so shifting is at the point where we actually start making new choices. But then the last part of the book is part 5 is sharing. And sharing is, what you were just talking about, that it's really this exercise in vulnerability. But especially in the workplace setting, like I'm really a big advocate of story healing, story sharing in the workplace, because I think it really creates a sense of empathy around like what our personal experience is, and that idea of common humanity, that we're not the only ones, that other people are also struggling. Because oftentimes when we're in these positions and we feel like we're the only ones, it can be very isolating. So we want to get into a place where we can actually share these things. And, it gets tricky because you don't want to share your whole life story, right? But what aspects of this do we share that can help others connect to us and us connect to them?
Yeah, I feel the encouragement in the workplace is don't share your stories. It's like, sure, talk about the weekend, talk about the family get together, but, don't talk about your abandonment and how your father was an alcoholic and or that type stuff. Do you get into that? Because I know you're working with leaders in the work that you're doing. You say you do encourage people to share their stories. So do you get to say to that level of vulnerability or encourage people to do that?
Yes and no. So, I think one of the last things I created before I left the government was a leadership course, and it was a human-centered leadership course. And the whole course was focused on the individual leader, which a lot of people, the first 2 days, the feedback we were getting every evening, because we would do a daily feedback, and it was just people were like, what am I doing here? This is not for me. And by day 3, we started to see a little bit of a shift happen. But, number one, I think with sharing in the workplace, we want to find themes around which people can connect. But I think there is definitely room to explore some of these deeper issues from childhood and whatnot, but in a way that feels like we create what we call brave spaces, not safe spaces, because there's no such thing as a safe space for some, like certain people who have certain backgrounds and stuff. So we want to create brave spaces where we know that, number one, we take out that element of perfectionism. We're not all going to show up and say the exact right thing. We're going to mess up, but it allows us to create the space together. And so it's this idea that we don't just jump in and say, okay, like tell us the worst thing that ever happened to you, right? But it's this idea that like, okay, let's start with, this is an issue that we're seeing in our workplace. How are you reacting to it? And so once we start to look at our own reactions, then we can dive deeper to say like, I wonder where that started. Like, why is it that every time this comes up, I just shut down and I, do everything else to avoid it because I don't want to be around it. So for me, like that was a big surviving story for myself, was anything to like, when you talk about fight or flight, but there's actually 5 reactions. So fight, flight, freeze, fix, and fake. And so for me, flight was a big one. I could spend hours binge watching television or, just anything to like not be in the reality that I had to be in, or fake. And fake is a very, very popular one for professionals, which is that we're not going to show any vulnerability. We're going to show up. We're going to keep saying like, oh yeah, I'm fine. I know what I'm doing. That's where all those perfectionistic tendencies come out, things like that. So the more that we can actually start to look at our own reactions, start to notice them, get curious with them, that's what we're encouraging in this kind of story sharing, is like, get curious with what's happening for you. And then to the extent that you feel brave enough to share certain aspects of that, like what's coming up for you? What are you noticing? Rather than let's take you back to your trauma and focus on that. This is not therapy. Like, we're not doing group therapy. We're doing this idea of mindful awareness, this idea of compassion. Can I be kind to myself when I'm reacting this way? And then especially when we're trying to shift, we are always going to have backsliding, right? We're going to be like, okay, yeah, I know now that this is my pattern. I want to break this. But we're working with like very, very deeply etched neural pathways that have been created since childhood. So these have become our default reactions. And so in order to change that, we have to start doing the new thing over and over again, and we will backslide. So what kind of compassion can we bring into this? And the more that we can start doing that for ourselves, and that's the reason we take leaders through this process of getting to know themselves, is because then it becomes easier to do it for others. And to be able to show that compassion and empathy and everything else when we can do it for ourselves first.
I love that you're bringing in the aspect of faking, because I think when someone has trauma, sometimes it's just so hard to even open up about that, and sometimes you get like, I know for me, I was just stuck in the cycle of faking, but I didn't even know I was faking. Through my 20s and halfway through my 30s, I didn't even know I was faking. It became my come from. And I love that you're helping bring awareness to that, because I think so often people, they don't even know that they're faking. They don't know that they're not living from their truest self because they've got this facade that has protected them for so long. And I think the work you're doing is so powerful, especially in the workplace, that you're going to bring that together in both aspects to help people really see that connection.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is interesting, right? Like with the reactions, the fact that we go through so much of our life on autopilot. We're not noticing anything. And then when you do start to notice those things, yeah, it's revelatory in a lot of ways. And yet it's been there the whole time,
I do find like this idea though, or concept around faking it, like I kind of get it in some ways, right? And not only as a leader, but even as a person. And again, during this energy renewal retreat, I was having a conversation with one of the ladies whose husband had passed away more recently. And I think most people know my story. My husband did too, but it's been 8 years, but what we were having the conversation around though was like right after he passed away, and people would say, how are you? And you're in the workplace, right? And you're like, your first response is, I'm great. I'm doing fine. Everything's fine, doing great. But were you really? But there was a part of me that didn't want to say anything else because I didn't want to burden anybody with my story. So it just became easier to say, I'm doing fine. I'm great. But then that would leave me feeling guilty because I was like, am I supposed to be great? Am I supposed to be fine? Maybe I'm supposed to be, sad. Maybe I'm supposed to be crying. And so you get yourself caught up in that, that's one trauma, but I can see it playing out in so many different traumas because you feel caught in the middle of like, I don't really know which way to go on this because either way, it kind of feels like I'm probably going to be judged. I'm not sure which judgment I want to take today. The one that says, wow, she's kind of callous, or the one that says, oh, dear God, run. I don't really want to hear her story. So, again, I just can empathize with the people that when you struggle with which reaction to you actually use when telling your story.
Yeah. And to what Lynette said, these are reactions that have protected us for such a long time. And to what you're saying, Angie, like, this is why we do it, right? Because we have that fear of judgment. Like, no matter what we decide, like, someone is going to judge us for something, right? But grief is such a tricky one. First of all, I think as a culture, like, we are not taught how to manage grief, and we're not taught how to support others through their grief. And so there is this fear of like, I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to, let people know how I'm really doing. I'll just paste a smile on my face and sit there. But I know, like, my experience with grief was, my mom passing away very unexpectedly and then showing up to work. And I remember just sitting in meetings and being like, what's the point of any of this? Like, I had such a hard time connecting back to the work, back to my colleagues, things like that. And to your point about, I think there is this fear of I don't want to ask any deeper questions because I don't want to take on their grief. I don't want to take on their sadness. And I think this is another skill set that, like, for leaders in particular, not just, and when I say leaders, like the leaders who have the titles, but I think all of us have the capacity to be like everyday leaders, right? Leading by example or whatever. And so I think this idea of empathy, because empathy does not have to be this grand, big gesture, or, empathy is literally asking the question and just giving the person, allowing the person to feel seen and heard. And it is a skill, right? It's a skill that we have to practice, because if we're not careful, we will take on other people's pain. We will take on their trauma, and we don't want to do that. But we also want to create these places where people can connect to each other on that level. Like I had one person in my workspace who was great about this, and she would regularly come by, just check in. And if I gave her that answer, I'm fine, don't worry about it, she'd come in and sit down and say, are you really fine? And I was never really fine. And so it would lead to other discussion, but literally a 5-minute discussion with her. It didn't have to go on for hours or anything like that. It just left me feeling like that sense of connection that I needed to stay afloat in those moments. And so I think that's another piece of this, right? It's like the workplace piece of this stuff is really hard, because we think a lot about the Industrial Revolution, and the kind of the legacy of the Industrial Revolution was this idea of we can create efficiencies, we can create, but at the end of the day, when you have human beings working for you, and again, in public service, in, healthcare, in, first responder work, if you're caring for other human beings, that what came out of the Industrial Revolution does not work. And so, Dominic, what you were saying about this idea that we're supposed to kind of compartmentalize ourselves, right? And we're expected to show up and just be like, okay, yeah, I'm not gonna get into my life or whatever. But I always say that as whole human beings, we do not leave a piece of ourselves at the door, no matter how much we think we can compartmentalize. Especially in these lines of work, it ends up doing damage to us. So whether it's damage to our mental health, our physical health, we see a lot of chronic health conditions, right? Our emotional health, our spiritual health, and then our relational health. We see a lot of really things that end up coming out in our relationships, whether they're with partners or whether they're with other family members, friends, loved ones, whatever. And so just because we're not creating space for it doesn't mean that it's not impacting our workforce. It doesn't mean it's not impacting our bottom line. It's impacting all of it. And so this is why, I think that in these human-centered fields, organizations really, it's one of the things that I really have a call to action for, is this idea of a holistic human-centered duty of care, where we're not just focused on, physical health and safety, but really what's happening to this whole human being. And I know that's a tricky thing, because we go to work. There's work that has to be done. But what I know from some of the things that we were doing at USCIS before I left is that when we were creating space for people to come together, to be in conversation, we had launched something called coffee chats during the COVID. It was a 30-minute session where we'd bring, 12 people could gather, and we'd have, they could talk about their anxiety. They could talk about, how hard it is to homeschool kids, whatever was happening for them. We had different chats available. And so 30 minutes of time out of the day, once a week, was enough for people to, number one, to connect with others who were similarly situated. But it was what the feedback we were getting from people was that it was allowing them to then focus on the work. And so I really think that there's an opportunity to do both,
Yeah. I think there's this aspect of getting what's inside of you outside of you, and that what's inside is, whether it's causing some type of agitation or some type of weight, whether that's a conscious, awareness or not. You said something about, how discussing these things can help in the workplace. I do a lot of relationship coaching, and there's one phrase if you don't process your childhood trauma, your relationship will. Meaning, yeah, so it's going to show up there, regardless. And I think I was at a conference last week where essentially it was a lot of biohacking, and it made me think of because you have a lot of people who are in the tech world and a lot of people, like financiers. So they're always looking for that edge. And I have felt for a long time, like you can get a really good edge if you process that stuff that you haven't dealt with, that you've been carrying around for decades. I usually encounter people when they're kind of in the decline of something, they've run into a big problem. But the process that you have of the storytelling, do you have a method for people to benefit from this process as a way of, say, preventive maintenance, or a way of resolving something before it starts to impact, say, like the work or another aspect of their life?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And yeah, like you, I think most of the time we're in kind of reaction mode rather than preventative mode. And so again, I think that all of this starts with onboarding. From the moment that people onboard, how do we create a culture where we're normalizing this idea of talking to each other, of getting to know each other beyond just what's on the surface. And a lot of this comes down to, how do leaders lead their teams? How do you create that trust and psychological safety on your teams? So during COVID, we saw the leadership program was a pilot program, and we had 24 leaders who went through it. And the week that we were there in person together, we had really focused again on this idea of cultivating our mindful awareness and tapping into compassion. And the leaders who were kind of going through this, and then also the other piece of this is we were helping them create an ongoing mindfulness practice where they were spending a little bit of time every day going through a different meditation practice, things like that. And what we found was, the funny thing was we did our in-person session with them 2 weeks before the COVID shutdown. And the way the program was structured was the rest of it was always meant to be virtual. And so the idea was we'd do 1 week in person, and then we would do 8 virtual sessions. And each month we were going to focus on a different kind of leadership related topic. Because of lockdown, we ended up shifting some of those topics. And so month 1 ended up being, leading through crisis. What do you need to do? How do you show up in a way to lead people through times of crisis? And what we found at the end of this, we actually had markers that we were benchmarks that we were measuring. And what we found was that the 24 leaders who went through our program, their teams came out of COVID much stronger and closer. They supported each other through that whole period when we were in our homes and all of that, versus all the rest of not just our agency, but definitely within our directorate. And so it really was very eye-opening for us to say okay, so we know that if we're helping leaders to kind of figure this out for themselves and noticing for themselves, then they're able to be there for their teams. They're able to create that space. And so the idea is that if we can get especially newer leaders through programs like this, meanwhile, have kind of a parallel track for newer employees so that everybody's speaking the same language, they're using the same terminology, that kind of thing. I think that's where the preventative piece of it can come in, is there has to be a shift in the culture, though. You can't just do one-off programs if the culture of the organization is already traumatized. And, we talk about organizational trauma because just like individuals can be harmed and feel pain and experience trauma, so too can the systems within an organization. And when you think about it, systems are created by individuals. So if individuals are bringing that into what they're creating, the systems are going to mirror that or reflect that, right? And so if those root issues within the organization aren't addressed and healed, doesn't matter how many programs you offer, doesn't matter how much stuff you do, your culture is not going to shift. And so you're never going to get that off the ground, and you will forever be in reaction mode rather than in that preventative space.
This whole concept that you were talking about a little bit earlier about the whole person, that is one thing that I really discovered in particular at DHS. But I would say a little bit at OPM, but more so at DHS, this concept that what goes on at work comes home and what goes on at home comes to work. And to your point, you're never going to compartmentalize this stuff. And so it really became, I think, again, for DHS, one of the things that I really tried to hone in on is this idea of mission readiness. Like, this isn't just an HR feel good woo woo kind of thing. This is about mission readiness. Because if you're, we were talking about like TSA agent who I think it was like over 4,500 guns they confiscated last year alone. If you're thinking about your 13-year-old and whether or not they turned off the stove when they made their mac and cheese for lunch, and whether or not, your 16-year-old is actually doing their homework or is instead, down the street selling drugs or whatever, you're going to miss a gun. You're going to miss something because you're totally not focused on the job at hand. And so that's why I think it's really incredibly important for organizations, not just the government, but for all organizations to really invest in their people and to have conversations with them regarding like, what are their needs? Where are they, currently in their life? And I will say, is to Dominic's point, but we've been conditioned not to have these conversations. And I mean, sometimes, like if you would ask them, like, how are your children or whatever, you always ran in fear of like, am I going to get an EEO complaint because I ask, about their marriage or I ask about their kids and stuff. And so I think that that's slowly starting to crack, and it's slowly starting to be okay for not only for leaders to tell their story, but for them to be able to ask how their employees are doing and get, an actual response from them. So it's encouraging. At least it was encouraging for me. I know it wasn't perfect, but at least we were starting to make inroads, in particular at DHS, with regard to these concepts. I think mostly because leadership really did agree that it was about mission readiness.
Yeah, I like this idea of mission readiness because at the end of the day, again, that's what we're there for, right, is to carry out the mission. And so if we're doing things to create a space where people will show up and be ready at all times, I think that's great. I think the challenges I've seen, I agree with you. I think that we're starting to see more people talking about these issues, and I think that's a good step in the right direction. But I still see, number one, a lot of leaders who have been in their roles for a long time, still fairly resistant to this idea of shifting things in this direction. But the other piece of this is, again, people not knowing how to balance like the workload. I know most of the kind of mid-level managers that I used to work with are so overwhelmed by the amount of work. And to your point, this work, the way that it impacts, it can have life or death consequences, right? So if you miss a gun, if you let in, a persecutor, like on the immigration side, or a terrorist, or if you're in the medical profession and you miss a diagnosis, like there's very real world consequences. And so I think that there's often this feeling like I can't, how am I supposed to do all this other stuff and still get the work done? And again, I think that that's where we have to, I hope stuff like this educates leaders who are in a position of influence to understand that, if we start doing the work together to heal kind of the root issues, we can get to that point of culture shift and build in the time. Like, I really think that this mental health and well-being has to be integrated into every aspect of policymaking. I don't know if you all saw that OPM had issued some new guidance, a memo a couple of months ago. And it was all kind of built around feedback they had gotten coming out of COVID, which is great. Like they're addressing a lot of the issues that came up, but nowhere in that memo, like not a single place in that memo was there anything about workforce health and well-being. And I thought, it was such a missed opportunity because that was the biggest thing coming out of COVID, at least that I saw for a lot of people, was how this was impacting their mental health, like whether it was the isolation of social distancing or whether it was now, I've got everybody at home and I'm trying to get the work done or whatever it was. But to completely not talk about that, I think is a real missed opportunity. And so I agree. I think we're making little baby steps, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. So,
of course, they had some part on understanding trauma, and they said, you take a trauma-informed approach, and they were very simple about it. So the trauma-informed approach is you just assume everyone has trauma. And I thought about it, and I was like, yeah, true. Yeah, absolutely. And I also do the comparison between mental fitness. And so mental health, but I look at, mental fitness and like physical fitness. And so I feel in physical fitness, it's very easy to understand. You want to get it up to a certain level and then you have to maintain it. No one ever reaches their last workout and says, okay, I reached this level of fitness and like I'm done. You have to keep going back to it. And I think the same is present when it comes to mental health and mental fitness. You mentioned your manager, he said every year, you'll do this training. And so at least it was on that cycle where perhaps here was something to bolster like the mental health. And I think in the workplace, if you combine a trauma-informed approach, assume everyone has something to work out, and then you just put in regular training, regular, say, workshops or something where people have an opportunity. I think it can begin to address that whole thing of like, that people have mental health stuff going on, and if they're not paying attention to it, they're going to get mentally flabby and they'll have to go back and get fit again.
And I think the key thing to what you're saying is normalizing, right? So if you're doing the things that you're saying in terms of, having like the regular programs, having the ongoing trainings, things like that, we're normalizing this idea that, hey, we all have to work at this. It's not one person that's having a tough time, but we all have issues we're going to need to work on. So we're going to normalize this. It's a part of being human. It's okay. But it's so fascinating how we are so willing to wear stress as a badge of honor and talk about how stressed we are and talk about how busy we are. But you throw in the word trauma and people are like, no, like, I don't have trauma. Like, there's a lot of shame associated with trauma. And so the more that we can normalize, like, that trauma is part of being human. Like, we are all going to experience something at some point. And there's nothing, it doesn't make us weak or unable to, stand up and do our jobs or anything like that. And so I like what you're saying, because I think you're right. Like, I think we have to have kind of this multifaceted approach where we're bringing in, so the leadership on one side and then having like these kinds of ongoing trainings and things like that. So again, to create that vocabulary, to create that sense of culture, because we're all kind of moving towards that same end.
And I think what you're saying is, about seeing a culture shift, I think is so important too, because as the more leaders can really drop into this conversation and really become more vulnerable and be able to talk about it, just the ripple effect that's going to have. Because to Angie's point, what happens at work goes home. So then these leaders are going to be able to share this with their family members, their children, their grandchildren. And I think that's where we're going to begin having that culture shift, because we don't teach this in school. We don't teach these basic conversations of how to be a human. We don't teach these aspects of it. And I think, like Dominic said, everyone has trauma. Even if it's, on the playground, you got your lunchbox stolen. Everybody has trauma. So the more we can bring it into a conversation and the more it gets out there, the more we, as a society, we can shift to this place of being able to help normalize it.
Yeah. And everyone has trauma, and it then impacts how they show up in the world, right? So the earlier that we teach our kids to notice their emotions, to notice their reactions in certain situations, and addressing those at a younger age, then they don't become those patterns that get repeated that most of us are now like trying to chip away at, But yeah, I agree with you 100%.
I think the thing like around resilience, we talk about this a lot, but for me, like the resilience is also teaching folks like it's going to happen, right? Bad things are going to happen to good people. And so it's like, how do you learn how to just sit quietly with that and feel the emotion, feel what you're going to feel, and then be able to process it in, in whatever time frame that you need to process it so that you can move through it and you can come out stronger on the other end. Because I think we've become a society in which, it's interesting. We say on one hand, I will say this, on one hand, I think it is, it's a stigma and we don't really want to talk about it. But on the other hand, I kind of feel like everybody wants to walk around and say that they have trauma, right? And they just want to wallow in it. And it wants to become like, it's like their badge of honor that they have trauma. And so when it becomes their badge of honor, then it's like something that they want to identify themselves with. It's not something that they've worked through and that they're sharing with others and how they went through a healing process. Instead, they just want to just walk around saying, you know, I've had trauma and therefore you need to be careful with me, or therefore, you know, you can't look at me a certain way, or therefore I'm offended by everything that everybody said because I've had trauma. And so I do think that we have to find a way to balance all of this. I certainly don't have the answers to all of this, but I just think we have to be careful whenever, you know, like, how far do we take all of this? That's where, like, I can just say as a leader, that's some of the things that, like, I would struggle with, right? With some of the folks, like those that were trying to work through their trauma versus those that wanted everything to be about them and their trauma, which never felt healthy to me, because it never felt like they were actually doing the work to try to heal. Instead, they wanted everyone around them to they just wanted that to be who they are, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, yeah. So, you know, to me, it makes a lot of sense. And, you know, in the client work I do, you know, sometimes I've had to part ways with clients because they're not doing the work. You know, people sometimes say to me and say, "Oh, Dominic, I can't do what you do." Like just hearing people talk about their problems all day. And I'm like, well, I don't do that. I don't have any energy to sit around and talk about someone's problems. I do have energy to help someone resolve, you know, a challenge that they're facing. And so I think, you know, my take on trauma is, like, for example, you know, when I was younger, I was overweight. Now, yes, I have a few pounds to lose, but I wouldn't say like I'm overweight, you know, so it's like, it's something in my past. And I think this is something that might be a bit controversial for people, but I do think trauma is something just inescapably. It's something that occurred and probably it is over. Meaning it's not ongoing. Likely a lot of times, you know, particularly if someone's showing up at work every day. The thing is, in the subconscious mind, there's no concept of like it being over. So it is still occurring from that perspective. So I think in terms of a framework that could be delivered to people is to help them understand, it's like what you experience, it's over in terms of in the physical realm. Now we have to bring it to a conclusion in the subconscious realm. And there are many processes, various ways to do that. And I think as long as people understand that, they can say, oh, I can get to the other side. And I do want to have empathy and compassion for people that say maybe aren't ready to make that journey, because it does open up other things. I mean, you do have to face things. But I think if people at least got the framework, they would understand that if, let's say, they're quote unquote in that wallowing period, it's just like there's compassion, understanding, and they also have the understanding that you're in some midpoint to your journey. It hasn't completed. And you don't have to live a life of just reliving your trauma in your subconscious. You can get to the other side, but it does require work. And perhaps in those cases where the people are not moving forward, I think in a workplace, maybe something like an EAP program could help out if they'd be open to it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's the distinction even within trauma, right? Big T trauma versus little t trauma. And so like there's so many little t traumas that are impacting us every single day, right? So we see poverty, we see, I would actually say like racism's a big T trauma, but you know, like the microaggressions, like we see and experience things every day and they build up. And so that's the other piece of this is my experience may not be at all similar to your experience, right? And so number one is kind of, I'm a huge fan of Ted Lasso. I don't know if you all have seen the show Ted Lasso, but if you haven't, definitely add it to the top of your list. But, you know, one of the underlying kind of things in the show is about curiosity and really leading into curiosity. And so this idea of, you know, why is this person like showing up in this space of being a victim rather than recognizing that they have a choice, they can, you know, do this for themselves. And so there's an element, if we can get curious about it, it takes out some of the judgment that maybe we start to feel for others and also getting curious about our own reactions, because we're going to have similar reactions in different situations too. And I think honestly, for like a lot of people of color, and I know from my personal experience, there was a lot happening for me within the workplace that some of my colleagues didn't experience or didn't see. And so what was happening for me really, and then what had happened in my own childhood, things like that. So between the lens through which I was already seeing things and then the things that I was experiencing, it cut a different way sometimes. And so part of that also is having that compassion and empathy to recognize. And I like what you said, Dominic, that maybe somebody is not ready yet. They're not in that same place in their journey as you, but also that our experiences are just very different sometimes. And so in that role as a leader, especially, I think it's a tough space to be able to kind of step back. And this is where I think curiosity is one of the best tools that we have to help us kind of navigate that with grace and with compassion for others.
I also like that you talked about having a brave space inside of your workshops and things, because I think it is the first person who can be brave enough to step out of the fact that they're living in this victimized state. It can help others do the same. Because, sometimes they're kind of a group mentality. No one wants to speak up and really say, okay, I actually am living in this place of being the victim. But then once we see others do it, it allows us to be brave enough to say, oh, if I step up and I actually walk out of this place, I can actually come out the other side with a whole different life.
Well, Dimple, I really want to thank you for sharing your thoughts today, your stories, and your passion for this very important topic. It's one that I find just really fascinating. And I would say, often we don't think about these topics or we don't discuss these topics as much as we should really within the workplace. And so I just applaud you for your efforts, not only for the book that you've written, but also for the work that you've done prior in DHS and then the work that you plan to do moving forward. It's really important work, and you do a tremendous job for all of us humans who are trying to, learn and understand all of this. So is there anything that you'd like to add before we pop off?
Well, thank you, first of all, for all of that. That was very kind. And thank you all for the work that you're doing as well. I am always very heartened when I meet people who are, kind of working towards the same goal of putting the human back in the center of everything. I think it's really important. I will say that the pre-sale for my book is on, so people can head to wherever you buy your books and you can find a link to that. And also you can find more out about that on my website, rootsintheclouds.com, or you can follow me on social media at DimpStory across all platforms, or at Dear Humanitarian on Substack. So.
Oh, I love that. Substack's really kind of cool. I'm just learning more about that. So I'm going to have to look you up on that. So thank you for sharing all of that.
Thank you.
Alrighty.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
You're more than welcome. I look forward to diving deeper into the stories behind the stories each month. For more information and to learn more about us, please go to www.anandalife.org. Have a wonderful day.